It was just another ordinary day in the courtroom. The cold, marble walls stood silent, the air thick with the quiet hum of legal proceedings. The judge, a man with a long history of dismissing cases as just another part of his routine, sat on the bench, his gavel resting in front of him. He barely glanced at the defendant as he heard the lawyer's arguments. This was nothing new. But then, Clint Eastwood, the man everyone thought they knew, the one who made a name for himself as an iconic Hollywood star, did something no one expected. He stood up from his seat, his eyes locked with the judge's, and without a word, he walked towards the front of the room. The courtroom fell silent. Whispers began to ripple through the audience. Clint, always the mysterious figure, was now walking with a purpose, like a man on a mission. His slow, deliberate steps were like a signal, something important was about to happen. The judge, a man used to controlling the room, let out a chuckle. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's this? You've decided to play your own role in my courtroom drama?" The laughter from the audience was barely contained, but Clint's face remained stoic. The judge, leaning back in his chair, didn't understand the gravity of the situation. He thought Clint was just another actor pretending to be someone else. But Clint wasn't acting today. This was no movie set, and the situation was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. Clint reached into his jacket and pulled out a small object from inside his coat. The room fell even quieter. For a brief moment, the judge's expression shifted, but he quickly masked it with another sarcastic smile. "Are you here to lecture me, Eastwood?" the judge asked, his voice barely a whisper now. "You've made your living off pretend heroes, but let's see how good you are at playing one in real life." Clint's hand hovered over the desk, and the audience could almost feel the tension rising. He dropped the object onto the judge's desk with a soft thud. It was a badge. A real badge. The judge's smile faltered as he reached for the badge. His eyes widened the moment he saw the letters etched into it, USSS, United States Secret Service. The room fell into a stunned silence. No one could believe it. The legendary Clint Eastwood, a man who had long been associated with roles of lawmen and soldiers, wasn't just playing a character. He was someone. And that someone was not just an actor. He was an agent of the U.S. Secret Service. The judge's fingers trembled slightly as he touched the badge. His mouth went dry, and his eyes shot back up to Clint, who stood still, waiting. The arrogance in the judge's posture faded, replaced by the unmistakable fear of someone who knew he was in over his head. "Mr. Eastwood, I wasn't aware," the judge stammered, his voice suddenly lacking its usual authority. Clint's gaze was unyielding, his expression unchanged. "I'm sure you weren't," he replied calmly, his voice a low growl. "But I'm here to make sure you are aware of the consequences now." The judge didn't know what to say. He glanced nervously at the officers in the room, but none of them dared to move. They were all unsure of what Clint's next move would be, and frankly, they didn't want to be caught in the middle of this. Clint turned and addressed the courtroom, his voice steady. "This isn't a game. It never was. What's happening in this room is bigger than you realize. You've all been played, and today, the truth comes out." The crowd was still in shock, too stunned to respond. But Clint wasn't finished. He walked back to his seat, his movements purposeful. His eyes never left the judge, who was still holding the badge in his hands as if it might somehow evaporate. "You may have laughed at me when I walked in," Clint continued, his voice louder now, making sure everyone in the room heard every word. "But you're going to stop laughing soon. This isn't a scene from one of my movies. This is real life. And this courtroom will never be the same again." The tension in the room was palpable, and for the first time in a long while, the judge found himself questioning his own actions. He had seen Clint Eastwood on the big screen, playing heroes and tough guys, but now he understood that Clint was more than that. Clint Eastwood wasn't just an actor. He was a force to be reckoned with. As the silence continued to hang in the air, Clint sat back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. The entire courtroom, once filled with the murmur of everyday cases, was now completely still. Every person in the room had just realized that the man standing before them wasn't there to be a part of the show, they were the ones who had become part of something much larger, a game they never saw coming. The judge, now clearly unsettled, cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood, this is highly irregular. I need an explanation. Now." Clint leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get it, do you?" he asked, his tone now ice cold. "You've been part of something much bigger than yourself. A criminal network. And you've been helping them. But that ends today." A nervous murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge, realizing the gravity of the situation, finally dropped his confident facade. His hands began to shake, and he quickly looked at his lawyers for help, but no one dared to intervene. I don't know what you're talking about," the judge stammered. Clint simply shook his head. "You will. But for now, just know this, everything you've worked for, everything you've built, is about to come crashing down." The tension in the room reached its peak. Everyone, from the bailiffs to the lawyers, was now fully aware that this wasn't just about a courtroom drama. This was real. Clint Eastwood had just brought the truth to light, and the weight of that truth was heavier than anyone could have imagined. Clint stood once more, his hand brushing his coat as he adjusted his posture. "You're not in control anymore. I suggest you buckle up. The ride's just begun." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood wasn't always the man everyone thought they knew, the gruff cowboy, the brooding hero, or the tough-as-nails action star. His journey was much more layered than the roles he portrayed on the big screen. His past wasn't one of luxury or fame, but one forged in the streets of California, where dreams were more often broken than fulfilled. Born in 1930 in San Francisco, Clint grew up in a modest household. His father, a steelworker, and his mother, a homemaker, didn't have much, but they instilled in Clint the values of hard work and integrity. Life wasn't easy for the Eastwood family, but it was full of love and grit, a perfect foundation for a young boy to dream big. Clint's early years were marked by a series of jobs to help his family make ends meet. He worked as a grocery store clerk, a lumberjack, and even as a truck driver before he found his way into acting. It was a rocky road, but Clint's determination never wavered. He wasn't just trying to make a living, he was searching for something bigger, something that could give him the chance to change the world. Little did he know, it would take more than Hollywood fame to truly make that impact. When Clint first arrived in Hollywood in the 1950s, he was just another face in a sea of aspiring actors. He wasn't the tallest, the most handsome, or the most polished. But there was something undeniable about him, a quiet intensity that drew attention. His early roles were forgettable, but they were the stepping stones to something greater. It wasn't long before Clint caught the eye of Hollywood producers who saw more in him than just a pretty face. But while Clint was climbing the ladder of success, there was another path that would change his life in ways the public never saw coming. The United States Secret Service had been keeping an eye on Clint for years, long before he played a tough cop or an investigator on screen. They knew the kind of man Clint Eastwood was, driven, determined, and fearless. These were the traits that made him a perfect candidate for a life behind the scenes, fighting for justice in ways that most people would never understand. Clint didn't sign up for the Secret Service to seek fame or glory. He didn't even want recognition. It was simple for him, he believed in protecting his country and its citizens. His life in Hollywood had provided him with the perfect cover, allowing him to slip into places most people couldn't reach. But it also brought him face to face with the darker side of society, the side of crime, corruption, and betrayal that was often hidden behind the glitz and glamour. His first assignment with the Secret Service was as covert as it was dangerous. Clint was tasked with infiltrating a criminal organization that was tied to political figures. These were powerful people, people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. But Clint had the skills, the experience, and the drive to get the job done. It wasn't long before Clint was in the thick of it, working with the agency's top operatives and gaining the trust of some of the most influential criminals in the country. In the shadows, Clint operated not just as an actor, but as a real-life protector. His Hollywood fame allowed him to move through high-profile circles, but it also made him a target. He was a man living in two worlds, one where he was celebrated as a film star, and the other where he was quietly working behind the scenes to bring down some of the most dangerous criminals in the country. But Clint wasn't alone in this mission. He had a team, a group of elite agents who trusted him and depended on him. Together, they dug deep into the underworld, uncovering links between the criminal organization and powerful politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement officials. It wasn't an easy road. There were times when Clint's life was in danger, when he had to rely on his instincts and his ability to think on his feet. But through it all, he never lost sight of his mission, justice. Over time, Clint's commitment to the cause deepened. He wasn't just working for the government anymore, he was working for something much larger. He believed in the system, but he had learned that the system could be easily corrupted. And that's why he kept pushing, because someone had to stand against the tide of corruption and make sure the truth was exposed. While Clint was uncovering these dark truths, he was also becoming more entangled in the dangerous world of espionage and covert operations. His Hollywood career became a mask, something that allowed him to move through life unnoticed while he continued his work for the USSS. But it also weighed on him. The life of secrecy and danger was taking its toll. And though Clint had learned to live with it, there was always the looming question of whether it was worth the cost. Then came the tragedy that would change everything for Clint. His closest friend in the Secret Service, a man named Jack Turner, was killed during an undercover mission. It was a blow that hit Clint harder than any film role he had ever played. Jack wasn't just a colleague, he was a brother. And his death, caused by a betrayal within their own ranks, left Clint shaken to the core. Jack's death was the turning point for Clint. He realized that the world he was fighting against wasn't just about criminals and gangs. It was about people, people who could betray you without a second thought, people who could destroy everything you believed in. The betrayal left a scar that would never heal, but it also solidified Clint's resolve. If the system wouldn't protect the innocent, then Clint would do whatever it took to make sure justice was served. In the years that followed, Clint's role in the Secret Service remained a secret. He continued to work quietly, uncovering more crimes, fighting corruption, and protecting the country from those who sought to tear it apart. But even as he carried out his covert missions, Clint never let go of his dream to use his fame, his voice, and his platform to make a difference. To the world, Clint Eastwood was a legendary actor. To those who worked with him in the shadows, he was a hero, someone who fought for justice without seeking accolades. He was both a man of the spotlight and a man of the shadows, a man who had seen the best and worst of humanity, and who knew that the fight for what was right would never truly end. It was a crisp, autumn morning when Clint Eastwood entered the courtroom. The tension in the air was palpable, an unease that was barely contained by the stark silence. Clint knew what was at stake. For years, he had worked in the shadows, watching, learning, and protecting. But today, everything was different. Today, the truth was coming to light, and the consequences would ripple through the highest echelons of power. Clint wasn't there to play games. He wasn't there for the headlines or the applause. He had a mission, and it was one that required precision, timing, and, most of all, courage. He had seen firsthand the level of corruption that ran through the veins of the government, law enforcement, and even the judicial system. And today, he was going to expose it all. The room was filled with unease as the judge cleared his throat. His voice, once booming with authority, now wavered. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, glancing nervously at the badge on his desk, "I demand an explanation." What is the meaning of this? Clint remained calm. He had been in far more dangerous situations than this, but this wasn't about physical danger. This was about something much bigger, something that threatened to unravel everything the public believed about justice. "I'm not here to explain myself," Clint replied coldly, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure the truth is heard. And trust me, you're not going to like what you're about to hear." The judge, clearly flustered, motioned to the bailiffs. "I think it's time for you to leave, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice gaining some semblance of its former authority. "You've made your point. But this is a courtroom, not a stage for your theatrics." Clint didn't move. He remained standing in front of the judge, his gaze unwavering. The courtroom was so quiet now that even the faintest rustle of clothing felt like a thunderclap. "You want me to leave?" Clint asked, his voice almost a whisper, but the weight of it reverberated through the room. "You want me to walk away and let you continue with this farce?" "Not today, Judge. Not now." The judge took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Clint Eastwood wasn't just an actor anymore, he was a man who had uncovered a conspiracy that could tear apart everything the American public held dear. As the silence lingered, Clint turned his attention to the gallery of spectators. His eyes scanned the crowd, many of whom had come to see a typical legal proceeding. But this wasn't going to be typical. Clint had a story to tell, and it was one that was far too important to be ignored. He glanced at a few familiar faces in the crowd, some were journalists, others were involved in the case at hand, but there was a look in their eyes now that hadn't been there before: fear. It wasn't just the judge Clint had to worry about. The deeper Clint dug into the corruption, the more powerful the people behind it became. And now, they knew that Clint was closing in. They had already made moves to silence him once, but they didn't count on Clint Eastwood's persistence. He had enemies. But they didn't know Clint Eastwood well enough. When you've spent decades playing a role, you get pretty good at understanding the stakes. Clint was never one to back down when it mattered. And now, it mattered more than ever. The judge looked at the badge again, his hands shaking. His face was pale as he struggled to comprehend the enormity of what was unfolding before him. "You're a federal agent," the judge said, his voice trembling. "But you've been undercover, all this time?" Clint nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's right," he said simply. "And I'm not just here for a show. I'm here to make sure this case doesn't disappear. The people who think they can pull the strings behind the scenes are about to find out they're not as untouchable as they think." The tension in the room escalated. The judge's demeanor had shifted from arrogance to fear, and the rest of the courtroom was on edge. Everyone in that room realized that Clint Eastwood was no longer just a figurehead in the entertainment industry. He was an active participant in a much larger story, one that would shake the foundations of the justice system to its core. As Clint spoke, his mind raced. He had come to a critical point in his journey. For years, he had been gathering information, connecting the dots, and waiting for the right moment to act. Today was that moment. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but Clint knew that the true battle was just beginning. The enemies he faced weren't just criminals on the street. They were embedded deep within the government, law enforcement, and even the courts. These were people who had used their positions of power to manipulate the system for their own gain. But Clint wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not this time. "I'm not leaving," Clint continued, his voice firm and resolute. "I'm here to make sure the truth is exposed. I've been in the business of uncovering lies my whole life, and this is the biggest one yet. The truth will come out, whether you like it or not." The judge's eyes darted around the room, looking for a way to regain control. But Clint's words had struck a chord with everyone present. The tension in the air was thick, and it felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Clint knew that this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war. A war for truth. A war that would take him places he never expected to go, and force him to confront the darkness that had been hidden for far too long. As the judge stammered, trying to make sense of what had just been revealed, Clint stood tall. He wasn't going anywhere. The conflict was only just beginning, and Clint Eastwood was ready to fight until the very end. The next few days were a blur for Clint Eastwood. After his dramatic revelation in the courtroom, the world seemed to shift beneath his feet. The press was relentless, hounding him for interviews and demanding explanations. But Clint wasn't interested in the media circus. He wasn't there to be a spectacle, he was there to bring the truth to light. As Clint drove through the city in his blacked-out car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. He knew that the people he was dealing with weren't just going to sit back and let him expose their secrets. The clock was ticking, and Clint knew it wouldn't be long before they came after him, hard. He pulled up to a quiet diner on the edge of town, a place he had frequented many times over the years. The small, nondescript establishment was the perfect place to lay low, and Clint knew the owner well. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled softly, and the familiar scent of coffee and pancakes filled the air. "Clint," came the cheerful voice of Betty, the diner's owner, as she wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to him. "What can I get you today?" Clint gave her a small smile, though his mind was elsewhere. "Just a coffee, Betty," he said, his voice low and steady. "Black, no sugar." Betty didn't push. She knew when Clint was deep in thought, and today, it was obvious. She nodded, turned, and walked away to make his order. Clint sat at the counter, his hands resting on the smooth surface, his mind racing through the events of the last few days. He had always known that bringing the truth to the surface wouldn't be easy. He had seen the power that certain people wielded, the lengths they would go to in order to protect their secrets. But he had never imagined it would be like this. It was no longer just a case of criminal organizations, it was a battle against the very system that was supposed to protect the public. Clint's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside the diner. He glanced up, his instincts immediately going on high alert. The car door slammed, and a tall man with a dark suit and sunglasses stepped out. Clint didn't recognize him, but the man's posture and the way he scanned the parking lot told Clint everything he needed to know. The man was here for him. Clint stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing as he observed the newcomer. The man's presence was no accident, he was looking for Clint. And judging by the way he was scanning the diner, Clint knew that whatever was about to happen was going to be significant. Betty, who had been pouring coffee for another customer, noticed the man too. She raised an eyebrow and gave Clint a subtle nod, warning him. Clint gave her a small, appreciative smile before sliding a few bills onto the counter. He wasn't going to wait around to find out what this man wanted. As Clint stepped toward the exit, he could feel the eyes of the man on him. Without looking back, Clint walked out the door, pushing it open with a sharp shove. The moment he stepped outside, he heard the man's voice calling after him. Clint Eastwood, the man's voice was low but commanding. "We need to talk." Clint didn't break stride. He was done with small talk, and he wasn't in the mood to play games. But there was something about this man that made Clint stop for a brief moment. He didn't know who he was, but the fact that he was here meant something had changed. Clint turned around slowly, his face stoic. "I'm listening," he said, his voice cold. The man stepped closer, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I'm with someone who has a vested interest in making sure you stop digging into things you don't understand." Clint's eyebrows arched. "I'm not stopping. I'm just getting started," he said, his voice firm, every word carrying the weight of his conviction. The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're a brave man, Clint. But bravery alone won't save you. You're up against forces you don't even know about." Clint's hand instinctively brushed against the gun concealed under his jacket. He wasn't one to back down, and he had been in enough dangerous situations to know that words were often just the beginning. "I'm aware of who I'm up against," Clint replied. "And I'm not afraid of them." The man's eyes darkened. "You should be." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in before he spoke again. "This isn't just a matter of exposing a few bad apples. This is bigger than you think. They'll stop at nothing to make sure their secrets stay buried. And you're only making it worse for yourself by continuing down this road." Clint looked the man up and down. His instincts told him that this wasn't a random encounter. This was a message, one that Clint wasn't going to ignore. "I'll take my chances," Clint said, his tone unwavering. "But if you're trying to scare me, you're wasting your time." The man's face remained emotionless as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "Just know this, if you don't stop, there will be consequences. This is your last warning." Clint glanced at the card, noting the lack of any identifying marks. It was just a plain, white card, but the weight of the gesture wasn't lost on him. He didn't take the card, nor did he flinch. He simply gave the man one last look. "I don't respond to threats," Clint said, turning and walking toward his car. "If you want to talk, you know where to find me. But I'm not backing down." Clint didn't wait to see if the man followed him. He got into his car, slammed the door shut, and drove away, his mind focused on the road ahead. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but one thing was clear, the stakes had just gotten higher. And Clint Eastwood was ready for whatever came next. As he drove into the night, Clint's mind raced with possibilities. The warning from the mysterious man was only the beginning. He could feel the danger closing in, but for the first time in years, Clint felt something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt alive. This was the fight he had been waiting for. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Clint knew one thing for sure, he wasn't backing down. The night air was cold as Clint Eastwood parked his car in the alley behind his apartment building. He had barely been home in days, spending most of his time on the road, trying to stay one step ahead of those who were closing in on him. As he stepped out of the car, his thoughts were a tangled mess. The warning from the mysterious man had been unsettling, but Clint had learned to deal with threats over the years. What bothered him more was the weight of what he was uncovering, the realization that the corruption he was battling wasn't just a few bad apples, but an entire system built on lies and deceit. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Clint hesitated before pulling it out, already knowing who it was. It was Sarah, the one person who had stuck by him through everything. She had been there when things had gotten tough, offering support and understanding when he needed it most. But lately, Clint had been pushing her away, consumed by the work he was doing. He stared at the message, which was short but packed with emotion. "Clint, we need to talk. I'm worried about you." He sighed, his chest tight with a mixture of guilt and frustration. Sarah was right to be worried. But how could he explain to her the enormity of what he was facing? How could he put into words the feeling of being hunted, the fear that if he didn't succeed, everything he had worked for would be for nothing? He couldn't drag her into this, not when the stakes were so high. But the truth was, he didn't want to face this alone. Clint typed a quick reply, "I'm fine. Just a little overwhelmed. I'll be okay." He didn't expect her to buy it, but it was all he could say. After a moment of hesitation, he put the phone down and entered his apartment. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, and it was almost suffocating. Clint sat down at his kitchen table, running his hands through his hair as he tried to process everything that had happened. The tension, the threats, the mounting pressure, it was all too much. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes and let himself think back to a time when things were simpler. Back before the badge, before the investigations, before the web of corruption had pulled him in. There had been a time when Clint had been a regular guy. He had family, friends, and a sense of purpose that didn't revolve around uncovering the darkest secrets of the powerful. He had a life. But that life had been shattered the moment he stepped into this world of deceit and danger. Clint's mind wandered back to the early days with Sarah. They had been inseparable, young, full of hope, and ready to take on the world. They had dreams of building a future together, but somewhere along the way, those dreams had faded. As Clint's career in law enforcement had taken off, their relationship had started to fray at the edges. She had never understood the weight he carried, the toll his job took on him. But still, she had always been there when he needed her. And he had always taken her for granted, assuming that she would always be there, no matter what. But now, with the walls closing in around him, Clint realized how much he had pushed her away. How many times had he lied to her? How many times had he told her that everything was fine when it was anything but? And now, with everything on the line, he wasn't sure if he could fix things. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he wasn't just battling corrupt officials and criminal organizations, he was battling his own demons, his own failures as a partner, a friend, and a man. The sound of his phone buzzing again snapped Clint out of his reverie. He glanced down at the screen, his heart skipping a beat. It was a call from Sarah. Clint hesitated, but then he pressed the green button. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Clint," Sarah's voice was steady but tinged with concern. "What's really going on? I can't keep doing this, just sitting on the sidelines, waiting for you to let me in." Clint leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the table. "Sarah, I can't drag you into this," he said, his voice hoarse. "You don't understand what's happening. The people I'm dealing with, they'll stop at nothing to silence me. I don't want you to get hurt because of me." "Clint, I'm not stupid," she replied, her voice growing sharper. "I know something's wrong. You're not just dealing with a case anymore. This is bigger than that, isn't it?" Clint didn't respond right away. He had always tried to protect her, but it seemed like Sarah was already ahead of him. She could see through the facade he had built around himself, the one he had used to keep her at arm's length. "I can't do this alone," Clint admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need you, Sarah. I need you more than I've ever needed anyone. But I don't know how to make you understand the danger." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Clint thought she might hang up. But then Sarah spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "You don't have to face this alone, Clint. I've always been here for you. And I'm not going anywhere. But you have to let me in. You have to trust me." Clint's throat tightened as he fought to hold back the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "I don't deserve your trust," he said quietly. "I've pushed you away for so long, and now I'm asking for your help." "Clint, you don't have to earn my trust," Sarah replied. "You already have it. But you have to stop shutting me out. We're in this together, okay?" The words hit Clint like a wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't expected. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel something other than the pressure and the pain. He felt a flicker of hope. "Okay," Clint said, his voice barely audible. "Okay, Sarah. I'll let you in. But this won't be easy. We're about to walk into something much bigger than either of us." Sarah's voice softened, and Clint could hear the determination in her words. "I'm ready, Clint. We'll face it together." And in that moment, Clint knew that no matter what came next, he wasn't alone anymore. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. Clint Eastwood had always prided himself on being able to handle anything that came his way, but now, for the first time in his life, he realized that maybe he couldn't do this alone. He had been living in isolation for so long, keeping his distance from those who cared about him, convinced that it was the only way to protect them. But now, as he stood at the crossroads of his journey, Clint realized that his greatest strength wasn't his ability to fight or outsmart his enemies, it was his willingness to let others in. The phone call with Sarah had been a turning point. It wasn't just about her support, it was about him learning to trust again. Clint had always been the lone wolf, but now, with Sarah by his side, he could feel the weight of his burden lift just a little. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope. He sat at his kitchen table, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. The investigation was far from over, but Clint had made a decision. He wasn't going to keep running, wasn't going to keep hiding. He was going to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. And with Sarah at his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Sarah. "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we go public with everything we know. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it gets." Clint stared at the message, his fingers tapping on the edge of the table. Going public? It was a risky move, one that could put them both in even greater danger. But Clint knew that there was no turning back now. The people they were up against were too powerful, too entrenched in the system. They couldn't afford to be passive anymore. He typed back, "I agree. It's time to make a stand." As soon as he hit send, a sense of resolve settled over him. He couldn't undo the mistakes of the past, couldn't erase the years of hiding from the truth. But he could choose what to do next. And for the first time in a long time, Clint felt a glimmer of hope. Later that day, Clint met Sarah at a small cafe in the city. It was a quiet spot, one that was far removed from the chaos of the world they were about to step into. As Clint walked through the door, he spotted Sarah sitting at a corner table, her eyes scanning the room nervously. He approached her, giving her a reassuring smile as he sat down across from her. "You look like you're about to sign a life-altering contract," Clint said with a half-smile, trying to break the tension. Sarah's lips twitched upward in a small smile, but her eyes were filled with determination. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just trying to figure out how much we're willing to risk. Because once we do this, there's no going back." Clint nodded. "I know. But we've already made our decision. We're in this together, Sarah. All the way." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Then, Clint leaned in, lowering his voice. "We need to go to the press. We need to expose everything, the corruption, the lies, and the people behind it all. If we wait any longer, we'll be out of time." Sarah hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Are you sure about this? I mean, it's one thing to fight from the shadows, but going public? That's putting a target on our backs. It's not just our lives on the line now." "I know," Clint said quietly. "But if we don't do this, if we don't take a stand, nothing will change. The system will keep grinding people like us into the dust. We can't let that happen." Sarah met his gaze, her expression softening. "I'm with you. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." And so, the decision was made. They would go to the press, release everything they knew, and expose the dark underbelly of the system that had protected the guilty for far too long. But Clint knew that this was only the beginning. The real battle would come once they made their move. They had no idea how deep the corruption went or what kind of forces they were about to unleash, but they were ready. As the days passed, Clint and Sarah worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, contacting journalists, and making their preparations. Every move was calculated, every decision weighed carefully. They knew the risks, but they also knew that the truth could no longer stay buried. The night before their big reveal, Clint found himself standing at the window of his apartment, looking out at the city below. The lights flickered in the distance, and the hum of life seemed so far away. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Clint thought about everything that had led him to this point, the years of investigation, the battles he had fought, the people he had lost. He had spent so long focusing on the mission, on the pursuit of justice, that he had almost forgotten what it meant to live. To feel the warmth of someone's hand in his, to know that no matter what happened, he wasn't alone. As he turned away from the window, Clint's phone buzzed once more. It was Sarah. "Tomorrow's the day. You ready?" Clint smiled as he typed back, "I've never been more ready." He put the phone down and stood up straight, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. Tomorrow, they would take the first step toward a new beginning. Tomorrow, they would change everything. Tomorrow, they would expose the truth. The morning light spilled through the windows of Clint's apartment, casting a warm glow over the room. The city outside was waking up, the streets bustling with the usual rhythm of daily life. But inside Clint's apartment, there was an air of tension that couldn't be shaken. Today was the day. The day they would expose everything they had uncovered, the truth that could bring down the corrupt system that had controlled their lives for far too long. Clint had barely slept the night before. The weight of what they were about to do had kept him awake, tossing and turning in his bed. Every scenario ran through his mind, each one darker than the last. What if it all went wrong? What if the people they were up against had more power than they could ever anticipate? But then, there was a flicker of hope, a reminder of why they were doing this, to end the cycle, to bring justice to those who had been silenced for far too long. Sarah had arrived early, as she always did when something important was at stake. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, reviewing the final details of their plan. Clint could see the focus in her eyes, the determination that had only grown since they'd started working together. "You good?" Clint asked, leaning against the doorway, his voice low. Sarah looked up, offering him a small but resolute smile. "I'm as good as I'm going to be. It's happening today, Clint. No turning back now." Clint nodded, taking a step into the room. "Yeah. It's just. I keep thinking about all the people who are going to be affected by this. This isn't just about us anymore." Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a look of understanding. "I know. But you know as well as I do that this is bigger than us. We can't sit on this information and let the corrupt system keep hurting people. We're doing the right thing." Clint didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved to the window, staring out at the city below. Everything felt so close, so real. They had the evidence, the proof, the names of the guilty. All they needed to do now was send it to the right people, make sure the truth was heard. "We're doing the right thing," Clint repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know if he believed it yet, but it was all they had. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Clint and Sarah finalized their plans, double-checking the details of how they would release the information. They had contacted trusted journalists, reporters who had the integrity to handle the truth responsibly. They would release the files to the media, make sure the story went public, and then stand back and let the chips fall where they may. As the clock ticked closer to the hour of their decision, Clint felt his nerves starting to rise again. He knew the risks. The people they were up against weren't just going to roll over. They would fight back, hard. There would be threats, there would be danger, but Clint couldn't let fear control him anymore. This was about more than just his survival. It was about the people who had suffered, about righting the wrongs that had gone unchecked for far too long. "We're ready," Sarah said, closing her laptop with a finality that resonated in Clint's chest. Clint looked over at her, his heart pounding. It wasn't fear he felt, but something else, a sense of purpose, a sense of clarity. The moment of truth had arrived. There was no going back. "We hit send in 5 minutes, Clint said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Sarah nodded. 5 minutes. For those 5 minutes, the world outside seemed to disappear. Clint sat down across from Sarah, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. The noise of the city faded away as they focused on the task at hand. Clint reached for his phone and checked the final details of the contact they'd set up with the reporter. His finger hovered over the send button for a long moment, as though the weight of it all was in that one motion. But then he pressed it. A small ping echoed through the room, signaling that the information had been sent. It was done. The truth was out there. Clint sat back in his chair, exhaling as though he had just crossed a threshold. He hadn't realized how tightly he had been holding his breath until it was over. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. And then, everything shifted. The phone in front of Clint buzzed, first once, then again. He grabbed it quickly, his heart rate picking up as he read the message. It was from the journalist they'd contacted. It's all over the news. You were right about everything. But Clint, we've got a problem. They know. They're already coming for you. A cold wave of fear washed over Clint as the reality of the situation set in. They were already coming for him. He could feel the danger closing in, but there was no turning back now. They had exposed the corruption. They had made their stand. Clint. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. She was watching him closely, her eyes wide with concern. What is it? They know, Clint said, his voice tight. They're coming for us. But there was something different in his voice this time. It wasn't fear, not like before. It was resolve. They had done what they set out to do. And no matter what came next, Clint knew he couldn't stop now. The truth was out, and that was the most important thing. We've come this far, Sarah said, her voice calm but strong. We're not backing down now. Clint looked at her, a new sense of determination burning in his chest. No, we're not. And so, they waited. The storm was coming, but Clint and Sarah were ready. They had taken the first step toward justice. Now, all they had to do was survive the consequences. The next few hours felt like days. Clint and Sarah sat in the small apartment, waiting, watching, as the world outside began to react to the news they had set in motion. The phone didn't stop buzzing. News outlets, social media platforms, and private messages flooded in, all asking the same questions. The truth was out, and the public was hungry for more. Clint paced the floor, his mind racing through a million thoughts. The first wave of coverage had been explosive, headlines screaming about corruption at the highest levels of government, police forces, and even corporate giants. Names had been dropped, evidence had been shown, and all the secrets that had been carefully guarded for years were now public knowledge. But Clint's victory felt hollow. The weight of what they had just unleashed was beginning to sink in. They had turned the spotlight on the corruption, but now the light was burning brighter than they had anticipated. They were no longer just investigators. They were the hunted. The phone rang again. Clint glanced at the caller ID, and his stomach twisted. It was Sarah. He hadn't been able to reach her since they'd sent the files out. Clint, are you okay? Sarah's voice crackled through the line, her tone edged with urgency. I'm fine, Sarah, Clint replied, trying to keep his voice steady. But I don't know how much longer we have. I don't think we have much time at all, she said. I've been hearing rumors. People are already looking for you. Clint's heart dropped. He had expected retaliation, but the swiftness of it was jarring. I figured as much. I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet. I agree, Sarah said, her voice growing more frantic. There's something else I need to tell you. The media, they've been talking to someone inside the government. Someone who knows what we've been up to. They're coming for us, Clint. And they're coming fast. A cold shiver ran down Clint's spine. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of what it meant. They weren't just at the mercy of powerful figures anymore. There were insiders, people who knew their every move. People who had been feeding information to their enemies. Are you safe? Clint asked quickly, his mind already working on their next move. I'm safe for now. But we can't stay here. We need to move. Now, Sarah replied. They'll be looking for both of us soon. If we stay in one place too long, we won't make it out. Clint's gaze shifted to the window. The streets outside were filled with people going about their business, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The calm before the storm, he thought grimly. "You're right," Clint said, his voice low. "We need to get out of here. I've got a place we can go. But we have to be quick." "Where?" Sarah asked. "A safe house. It's an old contact of mine. He'll help us lay low for a while," Clint replied, grabbing his jacket and heading toward the door. "I'll send you the address. Don't waste any time. We leave now." As Clint made his way to the door, his mind raced with the possibilities of what would happen next. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. He had spent his entire life in control, operating from the shadows, always staying one step ahead of his enemies. But now, he was in the open. And the people he had been fighting were closing in on him. He quickly typed the address into his phone and hit send. Then, without another word, he left the apartment and stepped into the chaos of the streets. Every corner felt like a potential threat. Every face in the crowd could be someone sent to find him. As he made his way through the city, Clint couldn't help but replay the events of the past few days. The release of the files had felt like a victory, a triumph over the corruption that had poisoned everything. But now that the truth was out, Clint realized that the battle was only just beginning. They had stirred the hornet's nest, and the only thing left to do now was survive. Minutes later, Clint arrived at the designated meeting point. A rundown alleyway, tucked away from the main road. The safe house was close by, but getting there was never as simple as it seemed. He sent one final text to Sarah, "I'm here. We need to move quickly." No sooner had he sent the message than he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing down the alleyway. Someone was coming. Clint's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, his senses on high alert. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Clint's heart skipped a beat. It was a man he hadn't seen in years, a former ally, someone he thought he could trust. But seeing him now, Clint wasn't sure where his loyalties truly lay. "You're still alive," the man said, his voice laced with surprise. "I thought they would have gotten to you by now." "I'm hard to kill," Clint replied coldly, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "What are you doing here, Peter?" Peter stepped into the light, revealing the grim expression on his face. "I'm here to help. But you've got to trust me, Clint. There's more at play here than you realize." Clint narrowed his eyes. "I don't have time for games. They're after me. We don't have long." Peter held up his hands, showing he meant no harm. "I know. That's why I'm here. I've got a way out. But you have to listen to me. This isn't just about the files. There's someone in your own circle who's been playing both sides. And they're about to make their move." Clint's mind raced. Someone from his own circle. Who? He couldn't think straight. But one thing was clear, he wasn't safe, not with the people he thought he could trust. "Who?" Clint demanded, his voice low. Peter hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Sarah." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "No. That's not possible." "I'm telling you," Peter said, his voice urgent. "She's been working with them all along. You've been played, Clint." Clint felt his blood run cold. If Peter was right, everything had been a lie. All the trust he had put in Sarah, was it all just a game to her? Before Clint could respond, a loud noise echoed in the distance, an engine revving, tires screeching. The chase had begun. There was no time to process Peter's words. Clint had to think fast. "We're not talking here. Let's move." With the storm closing in, Clint had no choice but to follow Peter's lead. But as they disappeared into the shadows, a deep, gnawing suspicion settled in Clint's gut. Could Sarah really be the traitor? Or was this just another trap in a much bigger game? Clint's mind was a whirlwind as he followed Peter through the darkened streets. His heart pounded in his chest, a slow, deliberate rhythm that mirrored the questions racing through his thoughts. Sarah? Could she really have been working against him this whole time? It didn't make sense. She had been his partner, his confidant, someone he trusted more than anyone else. They had been through too much together, survived too many close calls for her to be the one who would betray him. Yet, Peter's words echoed in his head, taunting him. She's been playing both sides. You've been played. Peter led him down an alleyway and through a series of backstreets that Clint had never seen before. They reached an old, dilapidated building at the end of the alley, a structure that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Peter glanced around nervously before pulling Clint inside. The interior of the building was just as run down as the exterior, with dust motes dancing in the dim light that filtered through cracked windows. The place reeked of abandonment and secrecy, a perfect hiding place for the sort of deal Peter was trying to broker. Clint didn't trust him completely, but right now, Peter was his only chance at survival. Where are we going? Clint asked, his voice low and cautious. Peter motioned for Clint to follow him through the narrow hallways. We're going to meet someone who can help you get out of the city. We can't stay here, and we can't go to the safe house. They'll be watching that place by now. But if we can make it to the extraction point, you'll be safe. Clint's nerves tightened. Safe. It was a word he had long ago learned to distrust. If anything, safety was a luxury in his line of work, and trust was an even rarer commodity. Who is this person? Clint pressed, his suspicion growing. You'll meet them soon enough, Peter replied, his tone evasive. But we don't have much time. The people who are after you, they're resourceful. They'll stop at nothing to get to you. Clint didn't say anything. He was used to being hunted, used to running, but this time it felt different. The stakes were higher, the threats more dangerous, and the sense of betrayal gnawed at him like a weight in his gut. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hall. Peter knocked softly, and after a brief pause, the door creaked open. A man stood on the other side, a tall, broad-shouldered figure who immediately assessed Clint with a cool, calculating stare. Clint Eastwood, I presume, the man said, his voice clipped, formal. Clint studied the man, trying to get a read on him. Who are you? The man smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. You can call me Carter. I'm the one who's going to get you out of here. Clint didn't trust him, but he didn't have a choice. He had to keep moving, had to stay one step ahead of the people who wanted him dead. What's the plan? Clint asked, trying to focus on the task at hand. You're going to leave the city. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, and it's too dangerous to stay here now. We've got a secure route out, but it's going to take some time to set up. Until then, you'll stay low. Stay off the radar. No calls, no texts, no contact with anyone. Clint's mind immediately went to Sarah. He couldn't reach her now, not with the people after him. Not with the suspicion that was starting to grow in his chest. But he couldn't leave things unfinished between them. If Peter's accusations were true, he had to know why. Why would she betray him? You're not safe here, Carter continued, pulling Clint from his thoughts. We'll make the arrangements, but you need to be patient. And don't trust anyone outside this room. Clint's instincts were screaming. Don't trust anyone. He had heard those words more times than he could count, but now they had a new meaning. Peter had told him that Sarah was the traitor. Carter was telling him to trust no one. How much of this was true? Was there a web of lies tangled so deeply around him that he couldn't tell who was on his side anymore? But even as doubt crept into his mind, Clint knew that he had to focus on survival. Everything else could wait. There was no room for distractions. After a few moments, Carter motioned for Clint to follow him further into the building. The deeper they went, the more isolated the place felt. A sense of dread settled in Clint's chest. He wasn't sure why, but the whole setup felt off. There were too many people who knew too much. The walls were closing in on him. "Stay here," Carter said, as they reached a small room in the back. "I'll get things ready. You'll need to move fast once the extraction is set up." Clint nodded but couldn't help feeling uneasy. Carter's confident demeanor did nothing to quell the anxiety rising in him. The longer he stayed here, the more exposed he felt. He needed answers, answers about Sarah, answers about who was really pulling the strings. As Carter left the room, Clint sat down on a nearby crate, trying to clear his mind. He couldn't think straight with all the questions swirling around. He had to focus on one thing at a time. Survive. But even as he repeated the word to himself, the doubt festered. He knew that the real danger wasn't just the people chasing him, it was the people he thought he could trust. It wasn't just the government or the corrupt officials who were his enemies. It was the lies that were being woven around him. The question of who was on his side and who was playing a dangerous game with his life. Suddenly, the door creaked open again, and Clint's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side. It was Sarah. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Clint's heart skipped a beat. There she was, standing in front of him, the person he thought might be a traitor, yet the woman who had been his closest ally for so long. "Clint," she said softly, stepping into the room. "We need to talk." Clint's breath caught in his throat. The world had just become infinitely more complicated. The room felt suffocating as Sarah stepped inside. Clint's pulse quickened, his grip tightening on the gun at his side. For the past few hours, he had been trying to convince himself that he was wrong, that Peter's accusations were nothing more than a scheme to throw him off course. But seeing Sarah standing before him, her familiar face filled with uncertainty, only deepened the question in his mind. Was she really the traitor? Her eyes flickered with something that Clint couldn't quite read, and for a moment, he almost felt the urge to trust her. But that doubt, planted by Peter, clung to him like a shadow, blocking any warmth or familiarity he might have once felt. "Clint," she said again, her voice strained. "We don't have much time. You need to listen to me." Clint stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've heard enough, Sarah. I've heard enough to last me a lifetime." Peter said. "Peter is lying," Sarah cut in, her voice sharper now. "I'm not your enemy, Clint. You have to believe me." Her words hung in the air, but Clint didn't know if he could believe them. Peter had been so convincing, so sure of himself. But then again, Peter had his own agenda, and Clint had learned long ago not to trust anyone completely. The question was, who was telling the truth? Was Sarah just another person playing him, or had she been caught in something much deeper than he realized? He took a slow breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "You've got some explaining to do. And this time, no more lies." "Why should I believe you?" Sarah winced, as if the word stung, but she stood her ground. "Clint, I never wanted any of this. I've been trying to get the truth out, just like you. But there are people, powerful people, who have been pulling strings behind the scenes, and they're not going to stop. They'll kill us both if we don't stop them first." Clint's mind spun as he processed her words. Could it be true? Had Sarah been caught up in something bigger than either of them realized? He wanted to believe her, but he couldn't afford to take chances anymore. He had to be sure. "I don't know what's real anymore," Clint muttered, rubbing his temples in frustration. "Everything's a damn mess." "I know," Sarah said softly, her gaze filled with remorse. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But I'm not the enemy here. I'm just trying to survive, just like you." Clint's eyes narrowed as he studied her. "Then why didn't you tell me about Peter? About what was really going on?" Sarah's face darkened, and she took a step closer to him. "Because I didn't trust him. I never did. He's playing a dangerous game, Clint. He's not just a bystander. He's got connections to people who would sell out their own mother for a paycheck. And he's using you. Using both of us. Clint felt his stomach tighten. Peter, using them? For a moment, Clint allowed himself to believe Sarah. He wanted to, more than anything. But then a sinking feeling settled in his gut, and his instincts screamed that something wasn't adding up. You're telling me Peter's working for the enemy? Clint asked slowly, his voice low with disbelief. Sarah nodded. He has connections to the people who want to take us down. I tried to keep you out of it, Clint, but things have gone too far. He's not working alone. There's a bigger network at play, and we're just pawns in it. Clint shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. He had always known there were shadows behind the scenes, but the idea that someone so close to him, someone he had trusted, could be a part of it, that was a bitter pill to swallow. I don't know who to trust anymore, Clint said, his voice low, barely more than a whisper. Sarah stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm, and Clint flinched slightly at the contact. Clint, I swear to you, I'm not working with him. I'm not working with anyone except you. I'm trying to help you. Clint looked at her, his mind racing. Everything was changing so quickly, and he couldn't keep up. But one thing was certain, he couldn't run forever. He couldn't keep hiding in the shadows. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. Then what do we do now? Clint asked, his voice steadier than he felt. We need to find out who's really behind all this, Sarah said, her tone firm. And we need to expose them before they can get to us. Clint stared at her, searching her eyes for any sign of dishonesty, but all he saw was determination. Maybe, just maybe, he could trust her. But there was no time to think about it now. They had a mission, and the longer they waited, the more danger they would be in. Clint glanced over his shoulder at the door. He could still hear the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, the ever-present threat of the people hunting him. We don't have much time, Clint said, his voice sharp with urgency. We need to move. Now. Sarah nodded, and without another word, she led him through the narrow hallway and out into the alleyway. The city was still dark, the quiet broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional flicker of streetlights. Clint's eyes scanned the surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. They moved quickly, staying close to the buildings for cover. Each step they took felt like it could be their last, but Clint couldn't afford to think like that. He had to stay focused. As they turned a corner, Clint stopped dead in his tracks. He could see shadows moving in the distance, figures closing in on them. Get down, Clint hissed, pulling Sarah into a nearby doorway. They crouched in the shadows, their breath shallow as they waited. Clint's pulse raced as the footsteps grew louder, and the shadows came closer. He knew they couldn't outrun them. Not now. They had no choice but to face whatever was coming. Just then, a voice cut through the silence. Clint Eastwood. I know you're in there. Clint's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, but one he never thought he would hear again. It was Peter. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint's heart raced, and his mind was a blur of questions. Peter. Hearing his name spoken in the darkness sent a chill down Clint's spine. The voice was unmistakable, and despite all the chaos swirling around them, it felt like a cruel reminder of the life Clint had been trying to escape for years. A life of deception, betrayal, and impossible decisions. He motioned for Sarah to stay quiet as the footsteps drew closer. Every instinct told him they needed to move, but with Peter so near, it was too risky. Clint's breath hitched in his chest, and he could hear the sound of Peter's voice growing louder as the man drew closer to their hiding spot. I know you're in there, Clint. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Peter called out, his voice firm but eerily calm. Clint cursed under his breath. There was no escaping this now. If they stayed hidden, Peter would eventually find them. But if they ran, it would be a chase, one they couldn't win. Clint didn't know what Peter wanted, but it was clear that the stakes were higher than ever. The game had changed, and Clint was once again caught in the crossfire. Sarah shifted beside him, her eyes wide with fear but also determination. "We need to confront him, Clint. We can't keep running." Clint met her gaze, his mind weighing his options. He didn't want to face Peter, didn't want to open up the old wounds that Peter's presence represented. But Sarah was right. Running wasn't an option anymore. They had to make a stand, or they would be hunted down like animals. There was no turning back. He stood up slowly, his heart pounding. "All right," he said, voice low but steady. "We'll confront him. But you stay close. And whatever happens, don't trust him." Sarah nodded without a word, her expression hardened with resolve. They stepped out from the doorway, moving cautiously toward the alley where Peter was waiting. The silence between them was thick with tension, the weight of the decision pressing on both their shoulders. As they turned the corner, Clint saw Peter standing a few feet away, his hands casually resting in his pockets. The man didn't seem surprised to see them. In fact, he almost looked pleased. "You finally decided to show yourself," Peter said, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I was beginning to think you were too scared to face me." Clint's jaw tightened, but he didn't let Peter's words provoke him. He had too much at stake now. "What do you want, Peter?" he asked, keeping his voice calm, despite the rage building inside him. Peter's smile faded, and his eyes narrowed. "You're not the only one with enemies, Clint. We both know that. But the difference is, I know who's pulling the strings, and you're just a pawn in a game you don't understand. You never did." Clint felt the weight of Peter's words. There was a harsh truth to them, something Clint had tried to ignore for years. His life had always been dictated by forces beyond his control, whether it was the government, corrupt officials, or the shadowy figures who had used him as a weapon. But now, it seemed like Peter was trying to make him feel small. Trying to take away the one thing Clint had left, his autonomy. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Peter," Clint shot back, his voice steady, though there was a fire burning in his eyes. "And I know what you're capable of." Peter let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Do you?" "Because I don't think you do. You've always been the guy who follows orders, Clint. But now, you have to make a choice. You can either come with me, and we can get this over with. Or you can keep running, keep being the pawn that everyone wants you to be. But there's no escape this time." Clint took a deep breath, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of Peter's words settling in. But he wasn't going to be intimidated. Not anymore. He had learned long ago that the only way out of situations like this was to face them head-on, even if the price was high. "I'm not your pawn, Peter," Clint said firmly. "And I'm not going to let you control me anymore." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Peter's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "You're making a mistake, Clint. But if that's the way you want it, fine. I'll just have to convince you otherwise." Before Clint could react, Peter raised his hand, signaling to someone behind him. Suddenly, 3 men emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by hoods. They were armed, their presence making the air even heavier with tension. Clint's hand instinctively moved to the gun at his side, but he didn't draw it yet. He wasn't ready to go down without a fight, but he had to play this carefully. Peter stepped aside, his gaze never leaving Clint. "I think it's time you understood the bigger picture, Clint. There's more at play here than just you or me. You've been used as a tool for far too long, and now it's time for you to realize your role." Clint's heart was pounding in his chest, and a cold sweat began to form on his brow. Peter's words made sense in a way, too much sense. Clint had always been a weapon for someone else's cause. He had always been the one sent in to do the dirty work, never asking questions, never knowing the full scope of what he was doing. But that wasn't who he was anymore. Not after everything he had been through, not after the people he had lost. He wasn't going to let Peter, or anyone else, dictate his fate. "I don't know what game you're playing, Peter," Clint said, his voice low but resolute. "But I'm done being a pawn. I'm done being used." Peter's face twisted with a mix of frustration and amusement. "You think you have a choice? You think you're in control? I've been in this business a lot longer than you, Clint. And I know how to make people bend to my will." Clint stood his ground, feeling the adrenaline course through his veins. He was done running. Done being afraid. If this was the end, then so be it. But he was going to go out fighting. "I don't care how long you've been doing this," Clint said, his eyes locked onto Peter's. "I'm not your pawn anymore. And I'm not afraid of you." With a sudden, calculated movement, Clint drew his gun and aimed it at Peter's chest. The men behind Peter tensed, but Peter himself didn't flinch. "Do you really think this is going to solve anything, Clint?" Peter asked, his voice cold. "You can pull that trigger, but you'll never escape the consequences. You'll never be free." Clint didn't answer. He was done talking. Clint's fingers tightened around the grip of the gun, but his mind was a whirlwind of doubt. Peter's words lingered in the air, like a thick fog that threatened to cloud his every decision. There was a cold certainty in Peter's gaze, a belief that Clint was cornered, that no matter what happened, he couldn't escape the world Peter had dragged him into. But Clint wasn't going down without a fight. "Step away from him, Peter," Clint said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pulsing through his veins. His eyes flicked between Peter and the men behind him. 3 of them, all armed, all waiting for the signal to make a move. Clint had no illusion that they would hesitate. Peter raised an eyebrow, almost amused by Clint's defiance. "You think you can take us all on? You've always been a fighter, Clint. But I think you'll find you're outmatched this time." Clint's grip on the gun didn't waver. He wasn't afraid. The fear had long since faded, replaced by something far more dangerous, resolve. He wasn't about to let Peter or anyone else control his fate. Not now, not ever. Without warning, Peter snapped his fingers, and the 3 men behind him moved into action. Clint's instincts kicked in, and he dropped to the ground, rolling to the side just as a bullet whizzed past his head. He fired a shot back, the deafening crack of the gun echoing through the alley. One of Peter's men dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder. Sarah moved quickly, ducking behind a nearby dumpster for cover. Clint could hear her breathing, shallow and panicked, but he couldn't afford to check on her now. He had to focus. They were outnumbered, and every move had to count. Peter was still standing, watching the scene unfold with detached curiosity. Clint had no doubt that Peter had been in worse situations before, but this time, Clint wasn't about to let him get away. Not again. Clint's eyes scanned the alley for a way out, but the exits were blocked. His pulse quickened as the men closed in, their guns raised. But Clint had been trained for this. He had faced down more dangerous enemies than Peter and his crew. He just had to get the drop on them. Another shot rang out, and Clint instinctively dove behind a metal barrel, narrowly avoiding the line of fire. He quickly peeked around the edge, catching a glimpse of one of Peter's men moving in. Without hesitation, Clint fired again, hitting the man in the leg. He collapsed to the ground with a grunt, but Clint didn't pause to watch him fall. He was already moving, a step ahead. Peter's voice rang out in the chaos. "Clint. This is pointless. You can't win. You know that, right? You're only making things worse for yourself." Clint didn't answer. He couldn't afford to. Peter was trying to get into his head, trying to make him doubt himself. But Clint had been through worse, had lost more than anyone should have to. He wasn't about to let Peter control him. He glanced over to where Sarah was crouched, her eyes wide as she clutched her gun. She wasn't a trained fighter like Clint, but she was no rookie either. If she stayed focused, she could hold her own. But just as Clint was about to make another move, something unexpected happened. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Clint's heart skipped a beat. There was no time to waste now. The police were coming, and they'd have no mercy for either side. Peter's expression shifted from amusement to frustration as the sirens grew closer. "Damn it," he muttered, his eyes darting around. "You really have no idea who you're dealing with, do you?" Clint didn't give him a chance to say anything else. He lunged forward, using the distraction to his advantage. The first man he encountered was still recovering from the wound Clint had inflicted, and Clint didn't hesitate. He swung the butt of his gun into the man's face, knocking him out cold. The other two men weren't far behind, but Clint was faster. He darted between them, dodging their attacks with precision, landing a punch to the gut of the second man and following up with a well-placed kick to the third's knee. The man howled in pain, collapsing to the ground. Peter's eyes widened in disbelief. "How the hell are you still standing?" Clint didn't answer, but he could see the doubt creeping into Peter's eyes. He had underestimated Clint. Just like everyone else always did. "Sarah!" Clint called, not taking his eyes off Peter. "We need to go. Now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward him, her gun still raised, eyes scanning their surroundings for any other threats. Together, they moved toward the alley's exit, Clint covering her back. But just as they reached the corner, Peter made his move. With a furious roar, he pulled out a hidden gun, aiming directly at Clint. Everything slowed. Clint's heart raced as the barrel of the gun pointed at him. He could feel the weight of the moment, the sheer finality of it. One pull of the trigger, and everything would end. But Clint wasn't about to let that happen. With a burst of speed, Clint dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bullet that tore through the air. Sarah fired back at Peter, hitting him in the shoulder and sending him stumbling backward. But Clint wasn't waiting for a second shot. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her into the street, sprinting as fast as they could toward the nearest exit. The police sirens were deafening now, and Clint knew they didn't have much time. They had to make it out of the alley before the officers arrived, or everything they had just fought for would be for nothing. They rounded the corner, ducking into another narrow side street. Clint didn't look back, he couldn't afford to. The only thing that mattered now was getting out. They ran for what felt like hours, adrenaline pushing them forward. But when they finally stopped, breathless and panting, Clint knew the danger wasn't over. Peter and his men would regroup, and they'd be back, stronger than ever. Clint looked at Sarah, her face pale but determined. "We're not done yet," he said quietly. Sarah nodded, her jaw clenched. "Not by a long shot." The air was thick with the heavy scent of rain as Clint and Sarah ran through the rain-soaked streets. Their footsteps echoed off the damp concrete, but the sound of sirens growing nearer urged them forward. They had barely escaped Peter and his men, but Clint knew they wouldn't be safe for long. Peter had resources, connections, and he wasn't the type to let things go. "We need to find somewhere safe," Clint panted, his eyes scanning the alleyways ahead of them. "Somewhere they won't find us." Sarah nodded, her face drawn and exhausted, but there was a fire in her eyes. She wasn't ready to give up yet. Neither was Clint. They had survived worse. "We can't stay in the city, Clint. Peter has too many eyes everywhere," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "We need to get out of here, fast." Clint's mind raced. Sarah was right. The city was too dangerous. Peter would have called in reinforcements by now, and every moment they stayed here put them at greater risk. They needed to get out of the urban sprawl, somewhere remote, where Peter's reach wouldn't extend. "There's an old cabin upstate. It's off the grid, no one will know we're there." "I'll take you there," Clint said, his voice calm despite the chaos of their situation. He had been to that cabin once before, during a time when he had hoped to escape from everything. It was a quiet, isolated place. Perfect for hiding out. "Upstate? How far is it?" Sarah asked, looking at Clint with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "It's about 3 hours north. We'll be safe there until we figure out our next move," Clint said, pulling out his phone and glancing at the map. "But we need to hurry." Sarah didn't argue. She trusted Clint, even if she didn't fully understand the depths of the situation. He had saved her before, and now, she was relying on him to get them both through this. It was a lot to put on one man's shoulders, but Clint had been carrying burdens like this for years. He wasn't about to stop now. They didn't speak much as they made their way to the outskirts of the city. The rain had picked up, falling in a heavy mist that blurred the lights of the city behind them. Clint's mind was a whirlwind. He could feel the weight of Peter's threat pressing on him, the knowledge that he was being hunted. They had to move quickly, but Clint couldn't help the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow, every car that passed, made him uneasy. The streetlights flickered, and he instinctively pulled Sarah closer to him. "Stay close," he whispered. His voice was barely audible over the sound of the rain. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She stayed right next to him, eyes darting nervously around the streets. "We're almost there," Clint muttered, but his words felt hollow in the silence that surrounded them. They were both running on adrenaline, but that wouldn't last forever. Clint could feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones, but he had to push through. The cabin was their only chance. They reached a quiet street where Clint's old car was parked under a tree, its headlights off to avoid drawing attention. Clint unlocked the doors, and they both climbed into the car, with Clint taking the wheel. As the engine roared to life, Clint took one last look at the city skyline in his rearview mirror. He had spent years trying to outrun his past, but every time he thought he was free, something like this would happen. Peter was only a symptom of a deeper problem, one that Clint couldn't shake, no matter how far he ran. "I'll drive," Clint said, his eyes focused ahead. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. For the next few hours, the world outside the car passed in a blur. The rain came down harder, and the roads grew slick, but Clint kept his focus. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Peter and his men wouldn't give up, and they would never stop until they had what they wanted. Sarah had fallen silent beside him, her gaze fixed on the dark road ahead. Clint could feel the tension between them, the weight of everything that had happened. They were on the run now, together, and there was no telling what would happen next. But Clint was determined to keep her safe, no matter the cost. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Clint turned off the main road, heading into the more rural areas. The buildings grew fewer, and the sound of traffic faded behind them. Soon, they were surrounded by dense woods, with no sign of civilization for miles. This was the place Clint had come to find peace when things got too complicated. It was isolated, away from the reach of people like Peter. The cabin was small, tucked into a grove of trees. It looked just as Clint remembered it, weathered, but solid. He parked the car and turned to Sarah, who had been watching him with quiet intensity. "We're here," Clint said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes flicking to the cabin in front of them. "Is this really going to keep us safe?" Clint hesitated before answering. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that they were safe now, that the worst was behind them. But deep down, he knew it was just a temporary refuge. Peter wouldn't stop until he had Clint back under his thumb. "This is the best chance we have," Clint said finally. "But we need to stay alert. They'll come looking for us." The rain beat down on the roof of the car, but Clint didn't move to get out yet. He sat still, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Sarah was right. They couldn't afford to be complacent. A thought gnawed at him, an old fear he hadn't let himself feel in years. What if Peter had already found them? It was a possibility Clint couldn't ignore. The thought of returning to the city and facing Peter head-on crossed his mind, but he knew that wouldn't work either. Not yet. There was still too much they didn't know. Clint took a deep breath, his mind settling on the only option left: stay hidden, stay quiet, and wait for the storm to pass. But deep down, he knew the storm was just beginning. He looked over at Sarah, who was staring out the window, her face drawn with worry. "We'll be all right," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time since everything had started, there was a hint of hope in her eyes. "We will be," she said softly. "Together." The cabin was quiet, tucked away in the dense woods where the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional drip of rainwater falling from the roof. Clint and Sarah had arrived just before nightfall, and now, as the sky darkened, a sense of eerie calm hung in the air. Inside the cabin, the walls were lined with old, worn furniture, a reflection of Clint's past. It wasn't much, just a small living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a single bedroom upstairs. But to Clint, it was home. It was a place where he could breathe, if only for a short while. Clint glanced around the room as he set down the bag he had grabbed from the car. A part of him wanted to relax, to sink into the moment and forget everything that had happened. But he couldn't afford that luxury. Not now. Sarah was already sitting on the couch, her eyes tired but alert, scanning the space as if expecting trouble at any moment. She had taken the role of the cautious observer since they had arrived. And Clint appreciated that. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't the end of the road, it was just a temporary pause. "Do you think they'll find us here?" Sarah's voice broke the silence, soft but filled with the weight of unspoken fear. Clint didn't answer right away. He stood near the window, peering through the rain-soaked glass. The storm had intensified outside, the wind whipping through the trees in wild gusts. He didn't like it. It reminded him of the chaos that had been following them. "They'll try," Clint said, his voice steady. "But this place is off the grid. It'll take them time to find us. And when they do, we'll be ready." But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his mind. He had no illusions. Peter had resources. And Clint knew from experience that once someone like Peter set his sights on you, there was no escaping. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching for reassurance. "And what then? What do we do when they find us?" Clint hesitated, trying to find the right words. He had no plan beyond surviving. He couldn't tell Sarah that, though. She was already scared enough. "We fight back," Clint finally said, his voice low but firm. "We don't give up. We'll keep moving. We'll stay ahead of them." Sarah didn't respond right away, but Clint could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, but it wasn't that simple. It never was. Clint crossed the room and knelt in front of her, his face softening. "Look, I know this is hard. But we've made it this far. We're still alive, and we've got a chance. That's more than a lot of people can say." For a moment, Sarah just stared at him, her brow furrowed in thought. Then, finally, she nodded. "I know. She trailed off, shaking her head. "I never imagined it would come to this. I thought when I left, when I decided to leave my old life behind, I'd be safe." Clint couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. He had dragged Sarah into this world, a world that was dangerous and unpredictable. It wasn't fair to her. But there was no turning back now. All he could do was protect her and keep her safe. "Sometimes, life has a way of pulling us into things we never expected," Clint said quietly. "But you're not alone in this. I won't let anything happen to you." Sarah gave him a small, grateful smile. "I know you won't." You've already saved my life more times than I can count. Clint stood up, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Let's just make sure there's no need for me to do that again. Sarah laughed softly, the sound a welcome relief in the tense atmosphere. But even as they shared this brief moment of levity, Clint knew it wouldn't last. Peter wasn't the kind of person to give up. Clint had seen it before, when someone like Peter was determined, nothing would stop them. As the night wore on, the wind continued to howl outside, and the rain showed no sign of letting up. Clint and Sarah ate in silence, the weight of their situation hanging over them like a dark cloud. There were no comforting words, no easy answers. Just survival. Clint sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. He had always found solace in fire. It was a reminder of how quickly things could change. A flicker of heat, and suddenly everything was different. It was a metaphor for life. He ran his hand through his hair, the exhaustion of the day catching up to him. But as much as he wanted to rest, he knew he couldn't. Not while Peter was out there, still hunting them. We need to be ready, Clint said suddenly, breaking the silence. We can't afford to get complacent. If Peter comes, we have to be prepared to move fast. Sarah stood up, her expression serious. What do you need me to do? Clint looked at her, a deep respect in his eyes. She was tough, tougher than most people realized. And she wasn't afraid to fight. Stay alert. Keep an eye on the perimeter. If we hear anything, we move. I'll take the first watch. Sarah nodded and moved toward the back door, which led out to a small porch. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the storm was still raging outside. She was keeping her distance, staying vigilant. Clint admired that. They were both playing the same game now, staying one step ahead of the danger. Clint sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He didn't know how long they could stay here before Peter found them. They needed a plan, and soon. But for now, they had to make do with what they had. The night passed slowly, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the rain pattering against the cabin. Clint kept his eyes trained on the door, on the window, on every sound that echoed in the distance. He knew that sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. But when the morning came, they would have to make a decision. Clint's thoughts drifted back to the cabin's quiet solitude. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had come here to escape, to forget. Now, it felt like a temporary refuge in the storm. The calm before the inevitable. Clint, Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. Clint's head snapped toward her, alert. What is it? She was standing by the door, her hand on the knob. I heard something. I think someone's out there. Clint's heart skipped a beat. Peter, he thought, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. They weren't safe. Not yet. The silence that had filled the cabin for hours was shattered by a faint sound, something moving in the woods outside. Clint's senses went on high alert immediately. It was too quiet before, and now the tension in the air was thick with the possibility of danger. Sarah's eyes met Clint's. She stood frozen by the door, listening intently, her hand still gripping the knob. Clint held up a hand to signal her to stay quiet. He slowly stood up from his seat, his body stiff with caution, every nerve humming in readiness. Stay here, he whispered to Sarah. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but Clint cut her off with a firm glance. Stay. I'll check it out. He moved quickly, quietly, across the room, his eyes never leaving the door. His instincts screamed that this was no coincidence. Peter's men were too efficient, too calculating to let something like this slide. If someone was out there, they were close. Too close. Clint reached for his jacket, pulling it tightly around his shoulders to keep out the cold air that had seeped into the cabin. He moved to the back door, his eyes scanning the dark, rain-soaked woods. The storm had calmed, but the wind still rustled through the trees, making it difficult to discern any real movement. He cracked the door open just a fraction, peeking outside into the pitch black. The woods stretched out like a vast ocean of trees and shadows. His heart raced, adrenaline pushing him forward. He stepped out, his boots crunching softly in the wet leaves beneath him. Everything seemed too still. Too quiet. Clint's hand gripped the gun at his side, and his eyes narrowed as he scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement. Then, he saw it, a flash of movement on the far side of the clearing. It was brief but distinct. A figure, cloaked in darkness, moving between the trees. Clint's heart skipped a beat. Who is that? Before he could make another move, he heard a sound, a soft rustling from behind him. He spun around, raising his weapon instinctively. Sarah. She stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined, her hands raised in surrender. Clint, she whispered urgently, I heard it too. What are we going to do? Stay inside, Clint ordered in a low voice, his tone sharp. I'll handle this. Don't come out unless I say so. Understood? Sarah nodded, but her expression was one of quiet resolve. She wasn't going to just sit back and wait, but Clint could see the determination in her eyes. She wouldn't be held back. And he understood that. He didn't want her to be involved in this. But the situation had long since passed the point of simple choices. It wasn't just Peter's men anymore. They had bigger problems to face, and Clint couldn't afford to let his guard down. Clint moved toward the trees, keeping low and slow. His breathing was steady, measured. He moved like a shadow, keeping to the cover of the woods, only stepping where he knew the ground wouldn't give him away. He was a hunter, a predator in his element. He could feel the presence of whoever was out there, but he couldn't yet see them clearly. Every step was calculated. Every breath held. Then, as he approached the edge of the trees, Clint froze. The figure was standing still, almost waiting for him. They were cloaked, hooded, their face hidden in the dark. Clint's heart hammered in his chest as he tried to make sense of the situation. This wasn't Peter's men. Whoever this was, they were different. The figure tilted its head slightly, and in that moment, Clint recognized something familiar in the posture, the confidence, the stillness. It was someone who had been trained, someone who knew how to be silent and deadly. Who are you? Clint's voice was low but firm, his gun raised slightly. The figure didn't respond at first. Then, with deliberate calm, they lifted their hands from under the cloak and removed the hood. Clint's breath caught in his throat as the face was revealed. Clint Eastwood, the person said in a smooth, cool voice, the words carrying an unmistakable weight. You don't recognize me, do you? Clint's pulse quickened. His grip on the gun tightened, but he didn't lower it. He stared into the stranger's eyes, dark, calculating, and calm. There was something about them that made Clint feel both uneasy and strangely familiar. Then, the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Your badge, Clint said, his voice a bit of a whisper as the shock set in. The person smiled, a faint, cryptic smile, and slowly, deliberately, reached inside their cloak. For a brief moment, Clint thought he was about to see a weapon drawn, but instead, the figure pulled out a small, gleaming object, a badge. Clint's eyes widened in disbelief as the person held it up. The badge was unmistakable. It was the U.S. Secret Service badge. Clint Eastwood, right? The agent's voice was as calm as ever. You've been a very hard man to find. Clint felt his heart drop into his stomach. This wasn't just some random stranger. This was someone from his past, someone who shouldn't be here, not now, not when everything was so complicated. The figure studied Clint for a long moment, then, almost as if deciding something, they stepped forward, their presence dominating the space around them. You've been running a long time, Clint, the agent said, their voice filled with something Clint couldn't quite place. But your run's over now. Clint's mind raced. 1,000 questions slammed into him all at once. How had they found him? Why now, after everything? He hadn't heard anything about the Secret Service being involved in any of this, at least not yet. But now, with the agent standing there, showing a badge that Clint knew far too well, he realized that the stakes had just been raised even higher. He needed answers. Fast. Why are you here? Clint's voice was strained, but controlled. His thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning in every direction, but there was one thing he knew for sure: whoever this person was, they had the power to bring his entire world crashing down. The agent remained silent for a moment, studying Clint, before finally speaking. Let's just say that we have some unfinished business to settle. Clint stood motionless, his eyes locked on the U.S. Secret Service agent. His mind raced as he tried to process the gravity of the situation. The agent's presence in these woods, at this moment, wasn't just a coincidence. There was a reason they had come for him. The agent's expression remained unreadable as they took a step closer, the badge still in hand. The gleam of the silver badge seemed almost mocking in the dim light, like a reminder of everything Clint had tried to leave behind. But it was also a cold, hard truth, the kind that Clint couldn't ignore. "I'm not here to play games, Clint," the agent said, their voice smooth but firm. "We both know why I'm here. And believe me, this is the last place you want to be right now." Clint didn't drop his guard. "What's going on here?" His voice was low, his words precise. "Who the hell are you really, and what do you want with me?" The agent glanced at him with an almost imperceptible shake of the head, as if Clint's question was too simple for the situation. "You don't get it, do you? I'm not just some random agent chasing you down. I'm part of a much bigger picture. The kind of picture you've been running from for years." Clint's stomach tightened. The agent's words carried a weight that he couldn't ignore. A bigger picture. The phrase felt too loaded, too ominous. He had seen enough in his life to know when things were spiraling out of his control. "I don't have time for riddles," Clint said through gritted teeth. He lowered his gun slightly but kept it steady, still wary. "What do you want?" The agent took a step closer, now just a few feet from Clint, and held up the badge again. "I told you before. This is unfinished business, Clint. You've been dodging the law for too long. You've made a lot of enemies. And now, it's time to face the consequences." Clint clenched his jaw, the anger bubbling up inside him. He wasn't ready to be dragged back into his past. He'd fought too hard to leave it behind. But the agent was right about one thing: he had made enemies, and some of them had the power to come for him whenever they chose. "I've paid my dues," Clint growled. "I'm out. This is over." The agent scoffed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Is it? You think this is over? This is just the beginning. You might think you've run far enough, but your past doesn't stay buried forever. Especially when people like me are still keeping an eye on things." Clint's pulse quickened as the agent's words sank in. He had hoped, prayed, that he could finally get a break from the ghosts that haunted him, but here they were again. The past, with all its mess and consequences, had a way of tracking him down no matter where he ran. "You're making a mistake," Clint said, his voice growing steadier despite the storm brewing inside him. "If you're here to arrest me, then do it. But if you're just here to drag me back into something I'm done with, then you're wasting your time." The agent didn't react immediately. They just studied Clint, their eyes narrowing as if weighing his words carefully. Then, in a voice that sent a chill down Clint's spine, they finally spoke. "You're right. You're done running. But that doesn't mean you're off the hook." Clint's hand instinctively tightened around the grip of his gun. The threat was palpable, and the agent knew it. But Clint wasn't going to be intimidated, not when he had so much at stake. Not when Sarah was inside the cabin, completely unaware of the danger that was now so close. "What are you talking about?" Clint demanded, his patience wearing thin. "What do you want from me?" The agent's lips curled into something between a smile and a grimace. I don't want anything from you, Clint. But they do. You've got something they need. Clint's mind whirled. Who is they? His heart raced as the agent's words hung in the air. He had a sinking feeling that the situation was spiraling into something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Who are you talking about? Clint pressed, his voice rising despite his best efforts to keep it steady. The agent's gaze never wavered. That's not something you get to know just yet. But you'll find out soon enough. They'll come for you, whether you're ready or not. And when they do, there's no place left to run. Clint took a step back, his mind trying to make sense of the cryptic threats, but nothing made sense. The only thing Clint knew for sure was that his life had just taken another dark turn. The last thing he needed was to be dragged back into the chaos that had almost destroyed him once before. You've made a mistake, Clint said again, this time with more conviction. I'm not the man you think I am anymore. I've walked away. I've put all that behind me. The agent regarded him with an expression that could have been pity, if it weren't so cold. You never really walk away, Clint. Not from people like them. Not from what you've done. Clint was silent for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. The reality was too heavy to ignore. If they were coming for him, if they were as dangerous as the agent implied, he didn't have the luxury of turning his back on the past anymore. And Sarah. God, what had he brought her into? Where is she? Clint asked suddenly, his voice tight with urgency. What have you told her? I swear to God, if you've said anything. She doesn't know anything yet, the agent cut him off, their voice still as calm as ever. But she will. Soon enough. Clint's heart dropped as a new wave of panic set in. Sarah. She had no idea what was happening. She was still inside, waiting for him to return. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Clint said, his voice low, filled with a dangerous edge. If you've hurt her, if you've even touched her. The agent held up a hand, almost as if to silence Clint, and gave a knowing smile. She's fine for now. But that won't last long if you don't start making the right decisions. Clint's eyes burned with fury, but he had to focus. There was no time to get emotional. The agent's cryptic words made it clear that Sarah's safety was now just as much a target as his own. They couldn't afford to stay here, not with whatever they were planning. All right, Clint said, his voice low and controlled again, I'll play your game. But you stay the hell away from her. And I'll deal with whatever this is. Just don't ever threaten her again. The agent nodded, a strange look of approval flickering in their eyes. We'll see how long you last. And we'll see how much you really want to get out of this. But don't say I didn't warn you. And with that, the agent turned, disappearing back into the darkness of the woods. Clint stood frozen for a long moment, the echo of the agent's words still hanging in the air. The world was closing in on him. And the real nightmare was only just beginning. Clint stood in the quiet of the woods long after the agent disappeared into the shadows. The only sound was the wind whispering through the trees, and the distant hum of rain still clinging to the earth. He could feel the weight of the agent's words press down on him like a suffocating cloud. There was no escape from this, no running away, no ignoring what was coming. The past had found him. He couldn't help but glance back at the cabin. Sarah was inside, unaware of how close the danger was. The agent had been clear. Soon enough, she would know. Clint took a deep breath and started to move toward the cabin. Every step was heavy, his mind racing through every possibility, every threat. He couldn't allow fear to take over, but the truth was, fear had already rooted itself deep in his chest. If Sarah became a pawn in whatever game was being played, Clint would have to make sure the cost was not his to pay. As he reached the cabin, he found Sarah standing by the window, her silhouette barely visible through the curtains. She hadn't heard him approach. Clint. Her voice was hesitant, and he could hear the edge of concern in it. What's going on out there? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked past her and shut the door softly, locking it behind him. Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowed with confusion. You're scaring me, Clint, she admitted, her voice quiet. What's happening? Clint's mind was still spinning, trying to process everything, but he knew he couldn't keep her in the dark any longer. She had a right to know. She was already tangled in his world, there was no going back now. Sarah, he paused, gathering his thoughts before speaking. There's more going on here than you realize. I can't explain everything, not yet, but I need you to understand something. He turned to face her, his voice dropping to a serious tone. You're in danger now too. Her face paled slightly, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her eyes locked on his. Danger? From what? Clint, I thought you said we were safe here. I thought we were too, Clint said, frustration creeping into his voice. But I was wrong. There's a lot more at play here. People, powerful people, are looking for me, and now, they're looking for you. Sarah's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. What do you mean? Who are these people? Clint clenched his jaw. He couldn't give her everything all at once. She wasn't ready for the whole truth. But if he didn't tell her something, she might end up walking into the fire without even knowing it. They're connected to my past, Clint said slowly. People I've crossed, people who don't forget. The U.S. Secret Service is involved. That agent, he's part of something bigger. And they've been watching us. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. The Secret Service? Why would they care about us? Clint, this doesn't make any sense. Clint walked over to the small kitchen table and sat down heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. It doesn't make sense to me either. But I know one thing for sure. They're not going to stop until they get what they want. And right now, what they want is me. Sarah sat down across from him, her face still a mixture of confusion and fear. What do they want from you? Why now? After all this time? Clint took a deep breath. I don't know everything. But I can tell you this, they've been patient. Too patient. And now, they've found me. And you. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I need you to be ready. If they come after us, we have to be ready to fight back. For a long moment, Sarah just stared at him, her face blank, processing the weight of his words. Clint watched her closely, trying to gauge her reaction. He had known from the moment they met that she was strong, resourceful, but this was a different level of danger than anything they had faced together before. I won't just sit back and wait for them to come for me, Sarah said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, the fear replaced by a quiet resolve. We fight. Together. Clint's heart twisted. He hadn't wanted this for her. He hadn't wanted her to be dragged into his past. But her determination, her refusal to let fear dictate her actions, reminded him of the reason he kept going. The reason he had to protect her. You don't understand, Sarah, he said, his voice soft but firm. This is bigger than us. We're not just fighting some petty criminals here. We're up against people who've been waiting for the right moment to strike. And we're right in the middle of it. I know what it's like to be stuck in the middle of something that feels bigger than you, Sarah replied, her tone gentle but unwavering. But I'm not just going to stand by while you fight this on your own. We're in this together, Clint. No matter what. Clint's chest tightened with emotion. She didn't know the full extent of the danger they were in. But in that moment, he realized there was no way he could push her away, not now. If they were going to survive what was coming, they would need to stick together. He stood up slowly, walking over to the small window by the door. His eyes scanned the woods, now shrouded in darkness. The storm had passed, but the tension still hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. "Listen to me," Clint said quietly, turning back to Sarah. "We don't have time to waste. We need to move. I don't know how long we have before they come looking for us, but it won't be long. We need to make a plan." Sarah nodded, her expression firm. "What's the plan?" Clint turned back toward the window, his mind racing as he formulated a strategy. He needed to get them out of here, out of the woods, before things escalated further. But he couldn't afford to be reckless. Every move would have to be calculated. "We head out at dawn," Clint said. "We make for the nearest town. Find someplace safe. Somewhere they won't think to look." "You think that'll keep us safe?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "They found us here, Clint. They'll find us anywhere." Clint looked at her, his eyes hard with determination. "I don't know if it'll keep us safe. But it's the best shot we've got." As Clint turned back to the window, his mind was already running through possible routes. There was no escaping this, no way out. But he would fight. He would protect Sarah. Whatever it took. The past had caught up with him, and now, he was going to have to face it head-on. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Clint and Sarah set out from the cabin, their bags packed with little more than essentials, food, water, a few changes of clothes, and Clint's trusty revolver tucked into the waistband of his jeans. It wasn't much, but it was all they had for now. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was one thing Clint knew for sure: they couldn't stay here any longer. The longer they remained in the cabin, the more likely it was that the agents, or whoever they were, would find them. Clint had learned long ago that when the past catches up with you, you don't get to pick the timing. You just have to run, adapt, and hope you can stay one step ahead. The forest was still, the silence broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the occasional bird call overhead. Clint kept a close eye on their surroundings, scanning the trees and the road ahead. Sarah walked beside him, her face set with determination, but he could tell she was still processing everything he had told her the night before. She hadn't said much since then, but Clint knew her well enough to know that she was taking it all in, questioning everything, wondering what it all meant. "We can't afford to stop for long," Clint said quietly as they walked. "I know you're probably tired, but we need to keep moving. I don't know what's out there, but we're safer if we keep our distance." Sarah nodded, but she didn't speak. Clint's gaze flickered over to her, wondering what was going on inside her head. They had never been in a situation like this before, fighting against an unknown enemy with no clear plan of action. But Sarah had always been resourceful. She had the strength to handle whatever came their way. He had to believe that. They made their way down the narrow trail that wound through the dense woods, eventually emerging onto a dirt road that stretched for miles in both directions. Clint's heart sank as he realized that, despite the isolation, the road led to civilization. The nearby town was only a short drive away, but that meant it was only a matter of time before their pursuers figured out where they had gone. "We need to get to town," Clint said, his voice tense. "But we have to be careful. We can't let anyone know who we are, not yet." "Got it," Sarah replied, her voice steady but laced with apprehension. "We'll keep a low profile." Clint nodded, but inside, he knew they were already running out of time. The U.S. Secret Service agent's warning echoed in his mind. Soon enough, she'll know. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let Sarah get pulled deeper into this mess. But the longer they stayed out here, the harder it would be to protect her. They walked in silence for a while, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Clint thought back to his years of running, his time in the shadows. It had been easier to keep his distance from the world back then. He didn't care about anything except survival. But now, with Sarah by his side, he cared about more than just himself. He cared about her safety, her future. As they neared the road's end, Clint stopped and held up a hand to signal Sarah to do the same. He could see the distant outline of a gas station up ahead, its lights flickering in the early morning fog. It was the kind of place people passed through without thinking twice, a small, nondescript pit stop for travelers and truckers. But to Clint, it was an opportunity. "We're going to have to make a stop," Clint said quietly, his eyes scanning the area. "But we'll need to keep it quick. We can't risk drawing attention." Sarah nodded again, her eyes sharp. "I'll be ready." They approached the gas station cautiously, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the few cars parked nearby. Clint's mind raced, running through the possible scenarios. They needed to blend in, no big movements, no attention. Just a quick stop for gas, maybe a snack, and then they'd be gone. The station was almost deserted at this hour. The attendant behind the counter barely looked up when Clint and Sarah entered, their steps light on the cracked tile floor. Clint walked toward the back, grabbing a couple of bottles of water and some beef jerky. He could feel the eyes of the attendant following him, but he didn't let it show. He kept his movements deliberate, controlled. No sign of panic. Sarah was at the counter now, paying for their items with cash, her expression calm but with an edge of something Clint couldn't quite place. He hoped it was just her nerves. This was a lot to handle, even for someone as tough as she was. They were nearly out the door when the sound of a car pulling up made Clint freeze. He glanced over his shoulder to see a sleek black sedan coming to a stop just outside. The engine idled for a moment, and Clint felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something wasn't right. "Let's go," Clint muttered, his voice low, urgency creeping into it. But as they turned to leave, the door to the sedan opened, and a man stepped out, his suit sharp and crisp despite the early hour. He adjusted his tie as he walked toward the entrance, and Clint's heart skipped a beat. The man wasn't just any traveler. He looked official. And worse, he looked like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Clint's instincts kicked in, and he grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the back door of the gas station. They couldn't afford to be seen with this guy. Not now. Not ever. They darted into the alleyway behind the station, Clint's breath shallow as he scanned their surroundings. There were no other cars, no hiding places. They had to keep moving. "We've got to go," Clint said, his voice urgent as he looked around for a safe route. "He's here for us." Sarah's eyes widened in fear. "Who is he?" "I don't know," Clint said, "but we can't stick around to find out." The sound of footsteps behind them, quick, deliberate, echoed off the walls. Clint's mind raced. He had a few seconds to think, but it felt like an eternity. He needed to make a choice. He grabbed Sarah's hand and sprinted down the alley, away from the gas station and deeper into the woods. Their only chance was to put as much distance between them and the man in the suit as possible. But Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random encounter. Whoever was after them had already closed in. And with every step, the danger was getting closer. Clint's heart was pounding in his chest as he dragged Sarah through the dense underbrush, each step driven by pure adrenaline. The air was thick with humidity, making it hard to breathe as the early morning mist clung to their skin. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder, each echo a reminder of the dangerous game they were now playing. They were being hunted. Clint wasn't sure how long they had been running. It could have been minutes or hours, time had lost all meaning. All he could focus on was the path ahead, the thick woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, offering no answers, only more danger. He glanced over at Sarah, her face flushed with exertion, her breath coming in sharp gasps. But there was no time to stop. They couldn't afford to slow down. "We have to keep going," Clint said through gritted teeth, barely pausing to look back at her. He could feel the tension in the air, a tight knot of fear and desperation forming in the pit of his stomach. They couldn't keep running forever, but right now, that was all they had. I can't keep this up much longer," Sarah gasped, her voice strained. "Clint, what are we going to do?" Clint's mind was racing, trying to find a way out of this. His thoughts flickered to their last few encounters, the agent at the cabin, the man at the gas station. He'd known they couldn't stay hidden forever, but he hadn't expected the chase to escalate this quickly. "There's a clearing up ahead," Clint said, his voice calm despite the panic building inside him. "We'll make a stand there. We'll figure something out." Sarah nodded, even though she was clearly struggling to keep up. Clint could see the fear in her eyes. She hadn't signed up for any of this. He hadn't wanted to drag her into his past, but now she was too deep, and there was no turning back. As they pushed through the trees, Clint's thoughts shifted back to the man in the suit. Whoever he wasn't a random passerby. He knew exactly who Clint was, and that made him even more dangerous. The U.S. Secret Service wasn't a group you could shake off easily. They didn't forget, ever. Clint could hear the man's footsteps now, closer than ever. They weren't going to make it to the clearing. The agent was closing in, and he had no intention of letting them get away. "Sarah, we need to make a move. Now." Clint's voice was sharp, commanding. He didn't wait for her reply, grabbing her hand and pulling her along as they veered off course, darting through the trees at a different angle. There was no plan, just instinct. He knew they couldn't outrun their pursuer forever, but they had to at least try to buy some time. They crashed through the thick underbrush, branches whipping across their faces, the sharp tang of pine needles filling the air. Clint's chest was burning, but he pushed forward, refusing to let his legs betray him. He could feel Sarah stumbling behind him, but she didn't fall behind. She kept up, her determination matching his. Suddenly, a shout pierced the air. "Clint! Sarah! Stop!" Clint's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, it was the man from the gas station. He was getting closer, too close. Clint's pulse quickened as he whipped his head around, spotting a shadow moving through the trees just behind them. He was in full pursuit, and Clint knew that if they didn't get out of sight soon, they'd be trapped. They couldn't let themselves get cornered. Ahead of them, Clint saw a large boulder, a possible spot for them to take cover. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He steered Sarah toward it, urging her to move faster. "Clint!" Sarah's voice cracked with panic. "What do we do now? Where are we going?" Clint didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the boulder as they neared it. He pushed Sarah toward it and then dove behind it, pulling her down with him. They both crouched low, trying to blend into the shadows, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Clint's mind was spinning as he thought of their next move. The man would be here any second. He could hear him now, footsteps crunching on the forest floor, getting closer with each passing second. "Stay quiet," Clint whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah nodded, her face pale but resolute. She pressed herself against the cold stone, her eyes wide as she peered over the edge, trying to see what was happening. Clint's hand was clenched tightly around the revolver in his waistband. It was his last line of defense, and if it came down to it, he would use it. But he didn't want to. He didn't want to make a move unless he had no other choice. Violence wasn't the answer, not yet. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away from their hiding spot, and Clint's breath hitched in his throat. He could feel the man's presence, as if he were standing right on top of them. For a long, tense moment, there was no sound, just the quiet rustling of the wind. Clint's eyes flickered to Sarah, and in that moment, their gazes met. They didn't need to speak. The unspoken understanding between them was clear. They would fight together. They wouldn't let the past win. Not this time. And then, just as the silence stretched on, the man spoke, his voice cold and calculated. "Clint," the voice called out, softer now, but still unmistakably commanding. "You can't keep running forever. It's time to face what you've been avoiding." Clint's heart froze. The agent knew him too well, too much. There was no more hiding. "We don't have to do this," Clint said, his voice low but steady. Leave us alone. There was a pause, followed by a laugh, a cold, empty laugh that sent a shiver down Clint's spine. Leave you alone, the agent scoffed. You've always had a choice, Clint. You just never made the right one. Clint's fingers tightened around the revolver, his mind racing with options. He couldn't let this man take control again. But how? How could he outsmart an agent of the U.S. Secret Service? And worse, how could he keep Sarah safe when they were so close to being caught? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind him. More of them. More agents. Clint's blood ran cold. They were surrounded. The forest seemed to close in around Clint and Sarah, the trees pressing in on them as though they were trapped in some kind of dark, suffocating maze. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing through the woods like an inevitable drumbeat, reminding Clint that the moment of reckoning was near. He could feel his heart thumping in his chest, each beat telling him that this was it, the endgame. But Clint wasn't ready to surrender. Not now. Not when he'd come this far. Not when he had Sarah to protect. The man in the suit wasn't alone anymore. Clint had heard the distant sounds of more agents, their voices sharp and methodical as they closed in. They were surrounding the clearing, cutting off any chance of escape. Clint's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He had to think fast. He couldn't let Sarah get caught in this mess. She didn't deserve any of this. We need to move, Clint whispered to Sarah, his voice low but urgent. He reached for her arm, pulling her closer to him, but she shook her head. No, she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. We're not running anymore. We're standing our ground. Clint's eyes widened in surprise. He had never seen Sarah like this, so resolute, so fierce. She had always been strong, but this was different. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back. Clint didn't know what to say. He just nodded, realizing she was right. There was nowhere to run. They were cornered. And if they were going to go down, they would do it on their terms. We're not going anywhere, Clint said, his voice steady, more confident than he felt. We fight together. The trees behind them creaked as the wind whispered through the branches, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Then came the voice that Clint had feared. I told you, Clint, the agent said, his tone calm, almost mocking. You've been running for so long, but now it's time to face the music. You and your little friend here, there's no escape. Clint gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening around the revolver. He couldn't show weakness, not now. He couldn't let the agent see fear in his eyes. He had to be strong, for Sarah, for himself. The past had come to claim him, but he wouldn't let it consume him. I'm not afraid of you, Clint said, his voice steady. You don't control me anymore. There was a long pause, and then the agent's voice came again, this time tinged with amusement. You really think you can just walk away from this, Clint? You think you can erase your past? Clint's grip on the revolver tightened, his jaw clenched. The agent's words cut deep. It was true, his past had haunted him for years. He'd spent his life trying to outrun it, but it always seemed to find him, always seemed to drag him back. He had made mistakes. He had been part of something dark, something dangerous. But he was done being a puppet to that life. He was done running. I've made my peace with it, Clint said, his voice low but resolute. But you're the one who still thinks you're in control. The agent's laugh echoed through the trees, sending a chill down Clint's spine. But Clint didn't flinch. He knew what had to be done. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound from behind them, and Clint whipped around, his heart racing. More agents were emerging from the trees, slowly but surely, stepping into the clearing. They moved with precision, as if they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. But Clint wasn't intimidated. He wasn't going to let them take Sarah without a fight. "We can't let them take us," Clint said to Sarah, his voice urgent. "Get ready." Sarah nodded, her eyes sharp and focused. She didn't hesitate. Clint had never seen her so determined. She was ready to fight. As the agents advanced, Clint and Sarah backed up against the large boulder, their only form of cover. The agent in the suit stepped forward, his expression cold and calculating. "It's over, Clint," he said. "There's no way out. You've nowhere left to run." Clint's finger hovered over the trigger of his revolver, his mind racing. His breath slowed, and for the briefest moment, everything went quiet. His pulse steadied as he realized something he hadn't been sure of until now. This wasn't just about survival. This wasn't just about running. This was about making a choice to stand up, to fight for the life he wanted, to fight for Sarah's future. "I'm not going to let you hurt her," Clint said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're done here." With a sudden, fluid motion, Clint drew the revolver from his waistband and aimed it at the ground in front of him. The sound of the shot echoed through the clearing, and the agents stopped in their tracks, startled by the sudden violence. "I said, we're done here," Clint repeated, his voice fierce. "I'm not going back. Not for you, not for anyone." The agent in the suit hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He clearly wasn't used to people standing up to him. But Clint wasn't backing down. He was done playing by their rules. He was ready to end this. Before the agent could react, Clint fired again, this time hitting a nearby tree. The loud crack of the bullet splintering the bark sent a clear message: Clint wasn't afraid of him anymore. The agent's face shifted from smug to something darker. "I don't want this to end like this," the agent said, his voice laced with venom. "But you've left me no choice." Clint was ready. He knew that this moment, this stand, would define everything. He had made peace with his past, but that didn't mean he had to let it control him. He wasn't going to let anyone take Sarah away from him. Not today. Not ever. The agent lunged toward him, but Clint was quicker, his reflexes sharp. In one smooth motion, he twisted out of the agent's grasp and fired the revolver again. The shot rang out, and the agent crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The rest of the agents hesitated, unsure of what to do. Clint stood tall, the revolver still in his hand, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He didn't need to fire another shot. He had made his point. "You're not taking her," Clint said, his voice steady, a hint of finality in it. "We're walking away from this, and you're going to let us." The remaining agents exchanged nervous glances. One by one, they began to retreat, their faces grim, but their steps hesitant. They knew they had been beaten. Clint turned to Sarah, his eyes meeting hers. She was breathing heavily, but there was something new in her gaze, something fierce, something that told him she had come to terms with the fight. She had stood by him, and together, they had won. "We're free," Clint said, his voice filled with quiet relief. Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, we are." And with that, Clint and Sarah walked into the woods, leaving the past behind them, their future uncertain but full of possibility. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?